A massive aid package is on its way to Ukraine from the United States. Just how did we get to a point where billions of dollars of U.S. equipment is flowing back into Ukraine? But is this just the start of a flood of cash that can hopefully be turned into real battlefield victories for the Ukrainians? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the Trump administration has officially approved its first Ukraine arms aid funded by NATO allies. This is, of course, a wild reversal from the administration's previous stance that's been that he's not going to help anybody. He's going to help Putin. He doesn't want to help. Nobody knows. The administration has no discernible policy. But one of the agreements that they've come to is to allow NATO countries, or rather European countries, to purchase U.S. weapons to equip Ukraine to fight the Russians, right? This is a part of a program called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, a list that NATO members, essentially, Ukraine says, listen, this is the number one most important thing. This is the number two most important thing, all right? Or probably it's like tranches. There's like an A priority, a B priority, and a C priority items. And NATO members can pitch in to a fund that will then make those purchases from the United States. The shipments are valued at $500 million a pop each, with 2 approved so far, and they were cleared by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby, the man whose official stance no one can seem to figure out, given that he alternates between hating Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But I think, as we've talked about, again, at this point, if you want to oppose China, you have to acknowledge that China is a proxy in this fight, right? China is the backstop for the Russian financial markets, as well as for the guarantor of protection for North Korean troops. Again, North Korea being dependent on the Chinese government for essentially staying in power. And so, again, Elbridge Colby, a notorious China hawk, as I am. And so the fact that he's finally woken up to the fact that China views this as a proxy conflict, so maybe the United States and its allies may consider, I don't know, trying to win. He's approved them. The packages will ship, quote, soon, as Washington is finally resuming arms deliveries to Ukraine financed by allied governments. Now, this pool allows them to buy American weapons, munitions, and equipment from U.S. stockpiles, and the initiative could provide as much as $10 billion worth of weapons, according to sources cited by Reuters. And what's interesting is that, again, this is different from U.S. President Biden's policy, where he provided large tranches of aid using presidential drawdown funds. Now, what I think is interesting about this, as they point out, is that one source said, quote, it's the stuff they've been asking for, a lot of stuff. And the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry is saying, listen, this is a mutually beneficial relationship for us, for Europe, and for the United States. Again, Zelensky said that Ukraine wants to get about $1 billion a month from its allies to buy these American-made weapons, in addition to a $50 billion partnership with Ukrainian companies to make drones and 10 U.S.-made Patriot missile battery systems. I think this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. The first is that the fact that it's a prioritized requirement list. See, initially, the presidential drawdown funds that were sent to Ukraine were, well, because they were drawdown funds, they weren't even necessarily, they were equipment that the U.S. had already purchased, that was sitting in U.S. stockpiles, following, usually purchased for use in the global war on terror. And this extra equipment was just given to Ukraine because it was sitting around. As I talked about, it's the equivalent of having a Toyota Camry that runs fine and sitting parked in your front lawn. You go, yeah, I bought this when I was commuting to work, but you go, well, now I work from home and I don't really need a whole extra car. So why don't you have it, Ukraine, right? And of course, the number we associated with that was some sort of Pentagon math, like the purchase price or something, right? The purchase price, but in today's dollars, or a depreciated amount. Pentagon math is just weird. And so the problem with that, though, is that some of that stuff, Ukraine was like, fuck yes. Some of it, Ukraine said, okay, well, this isn't exactly what we need, but we can use it. An MRAP is a great example of that. Actually, I think the MRAPs are actually pretty sought after now. Those seem to be a good example of like a battlefield survivable vehicle. Ukraine's like, listen, there's some stuff that like we really need, and there's some things that we can produce like our own stuff at home, right? Again, it's like the meme, you want McDonald's, but we have McDonald's at home, and McDonald's at home is good enough. Well, some stuff, Ukraine goes, listen, we can get, like, we'll take javelins if you got them, but we have Javelins at home. We just strap an RPG warhead to a quadcopter and it works fine. But there's some stuff where they go, we don't have this at home, right? This is the McDonald's we don't have at home, right? We don't have sushi at home, right? And so this list, because it's prioritized, Ukraine says, listen, no, don't worry about buying us the McDonald's. We can make it home. Buy the sushi, okay? And in this case, it's almost certainly Patriot missiles and Patriot missile batteries. It is a lot of air defenses. It is all the air defenses we can get our hands on. And $12 billion is no joke, right? It is a lot. As we talked about, the $18 billion aid to Ukraine package from 18 months ago was seen as sustaining actually the war effort for some time for Ukraine. So this is actually this is actually returning to a sustainable level of support for Ukraine if it persists. One of the problems we've talked about is that the president, depending on how he wakes up that in any given day, is going to dictate whether or not this happens, which is not really how the system is supposed to work, right? The president can't really impound funds that Congress has approved, et cetera. But this Congress seems to just be willing to kiss the president's ass in ways that no other U.S. president has ever had. And so now we're seeing the fact that at least until the president decides that he needs to put his finger in this again, what we're going to see at least is a flow of arms really from the Europeans to the Ukrainians back to, or a flow of arms from European money, U.S. factories to the Ukrainians. And so, if you're a shareholder of Lockheed Martin or whatever, you're probably loving it. But if you love that, well, you're going to love this news because Germany has softened its stance on frozen Russian funds. Now, can you think of an event that happened that might have spurred Germany to say, maybe we should just tap these Russian funds? And I don't know, like Putin's attack on NATO, for example. Germany shifted its position, now supports using frozen Russian sovereign funds to fund Ukraine's needs. Now, this is something that's been pretty interesting because there's about $300 billion of Russian central bank assets held in the Belgian clearinghouse Euroclear. Now, the Europeans at the start of the war sort of put themselves in a weird position. So what European central bank funds are is when you have an exchange rate, you need to be able to stabilize that exchange rate. And to do that, what you do is, let's say the Russian ruble is too weak. There's not enough demand for it. Well, a central bank can go, listen, we're just going to buy Russian rubles using euros or using USD or using yuan or whatever you want. And they just do this deal until the price stabilizes to whatever level they want. That means that central banks sit on a lot of assets, right? And Russia basically we know now that Russia expected to be fighting Ukraine and expected to be sanctioned because it built this $300 billion war chest of cash that it was going to use to stabilize its currency as it got sanctioned and as the war persisted. The problem is that the Europeans did something they had never done before. They impounded it. They said, listen, Russia, because you invaded your neighbor, it's still yours, but we're not going to let you spend this on weapons, dog. We're not going to let you spend this $300 billion on stabilizing your economy. We'll give it back to you when you behave, right? And for years, that's been the case. They said, listen, that money is Russia's. We'll give it back to Russia when they behave. But, well, there's some stuff that's happened. See, the problem is it's a central bank currency. It's not kept in cash. There's not stacks of euros. It's kept in bonds. It's kept in all kinds of different assets. And what's happened is those assets have grown in value. And so the G7 countries initially said, okay, well, Russia's not entitled to more money, right? They're not entitled to the windfall profits from the fact that they would have spent this money on their war. So we've said, listen, let's give the profits from that. Technically what they did is said, let's get a loan against the profits of this, and then we're going to give that loan to Ukraine. But now the Germans are saying, listen, if the U.S. bails on Ukraine entirely, which, again, we're never more than one mini stroke from the president doing, Germany goes, well, we're going to be footing the bill for this because we're the largest European economy. And we need to find a way to actually get these assets and, give them to Ukraine so that the German taxpayer isn't stuck doing it. So the options that they're considering aren't outright seizure, but supported by the US and some European countries, but they're saying generating revenue from the assets that are a little bit more aggressive. And Ukraine currently, of course, receives funds from that loan we talked about, but there's other ways to sort of not use the funds, but draw on them, maybe take loans out instead of against the proceeds, but against the actual funds themselves or something. There's definitely some options here. So that's what I think is interesting. But also a sign, I think, that the Europeans are finally starting to realize that Russia would never treat them the reverse. Like, there's no scenario in which Putin would allow $300 billion in German cash to sit in Russian banks for a week if they thought Germany was wronging them. Okay? They would seize that cash in a heartbeat, just like Russia has seized U.S. companies. They've fined Google $200 gorgillion, right? There's all of this preposterous Russian, like the Russian courts exist only to enact Putin's will. And so if he wants assets seized, he just goes ahead and seizes them. And I think that is the big takeaway here, is that the Europeans are starting to slowly, gradually realize that they might actually be in a war with an actual adversary. That as naive as they've been about the threat of Russia, it's not a threat anymore. It's not a potential threat, a potential problem down the road. It's today's problem. The Europeans, they don't have a military that can fight them, right? The European, if Russia can beat Ukraine and confront NATO militarily, NATO's conventionally fucked. And they might even be fucked in a nuclear sense. But the one area where they are not fucked is economically. They are still a larger, more powerful bloc, even as individuals. As individual countries, they are larger than Russia. Collectively, they're vastly larger than Russia. So they say, listen, they're finally waking up to the reality. We need to find ways to economically kick Russia in the throat. And yeah, that means sort of outsourcing a lot of their stuff, outsourcing the fighting to Ukraine, outsourcing the weapons manufacturing to the United States. But it still is start of this slow European awakening that we're finally starting to see. Now, if you guys want to help the Ukrainians out, trust me, this is not the panacea that you might think it is. This is just like a normal level of funding. But if you want to help out Ukraine's best units fighting in Kramatorsk, we have an anonymous donor who said that for every dollar that we raise, they are going to match $1 themselves, up to 300 grand. So if you want to double your value, right, and help out Ukraine's best drone units, the 93rd. Literally, I met these guys. They are legitimately the best. The 25th, Azov, 79th, SOF, 82nd, Liu. All of them need lots of help for all their drones, power stations, antennas, everything they need, all operating out of Kramatorsk. So hook them up. Plus, they got some patches, including a patch from Corvus, which I think is sick. Again, these are guys I personally met, so I'm biased. But huge thank you to our Colonel tier members over at combatvetnews.com, AL90, James Porsche, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, William Alex, Henry Roussier, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. Hit that subscribe. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Cheers.